Hi, and welcome back to ADK Talks, the podcast from ADK Taste, your curated guide to the best places, people, food, history, and experiences in the Adirondacks. I'm your host, Jane, and I'm joined by my co-host and brother, Steve. Say hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
And as you know, in every episode, we explore the stories that make the region one of the most fascinating places in America. Today, we're heading to Bolton Landing on Lake George, the Queen of American Lakes, to talk about a museum exhibit that sparked memories, conversations, and more than a few I remember that moments. It's called Welcome to Lake George, Vacation Paradise of the 50s and 60s, and it looks back at a time when Lake George transformed into one of the premier family vacation destinations in the Northeast. Think roadside motels, cabin colonies, Storytown, frontier towns, speedboats, postcards, and family road trips. And for us, this topic feels personal. Growing up, we heard stories about the heyday of Lake George tourism, and in some ways, we lived it. Steve and I were big fans of Frontier Town and Storytown when we were kids, and it was almost like our East Coast version of Disneyland, and it was a fantastic place to visit. But this exhibit isn't just about nostalgia. It's about understanding how a region reinvented itself and how tourism shaped the Lake George we know today. Joining us are Lisa Hall, Vice President of the Bolton Museum and curator of the exhibit, and Toni Hall, publisher of the Lake George Mirror. We'll talk about the exhibit, the significance of the Bolton Museum, and the fascinating story of how Lake George became vacation paradise. Lisa and Toni, welcome.
Hi.
For listeners who haven't visited, what is the Bolton Museum?
The Bolton Museum is a local historical museum. It was created in the early 70s at a time when every small town in the Adirondacks was collecting their own history and displaying it. When the Adirondack Center Museum was created in Elizabethtown, I remember that William Chapman White, the great Herald Tribune columnist, wrote about it for that newspaper, and he said, these towns are beginning to understand that they've got a lot of history. And it was this realization that led people to look in their attics, look in their basements, see what they had, and cumulatively, a history began to emerge that told the stories of every individual community, but connected those communities with the larger forces, the economic, the political, and the social forces that had shaped America, especially a vanishing America. Most of these local museums collected a lot of, for instance, agricultural implements, precisely because that's how people made their living, and that was the past that was quickly vanishing.
The museum occupies a former church in Rogers Park. Can you tell us a little something about the building and its history?
It was a small Catholic church built in the 1890s that was decommissioned in the 1970s as the congregation grew, and they moved to a larger church, and the congregation, or the Diocese of Albany, transferred title to the building to the town of Bolton. And then several years ago,
Almost 10
years ago, a wing was built to display collections and temporary exhibitions, which is where the Welcome to Lake George is now being displayed.
I want to not get off on too far of a tangent, but it's a really beautiful building. I was, really taken by the new part, and I know the older part, you're using part of it and you're doing some renovations. And I'd never actually, in all my years, never really been in Rogers Park before. So I want to just let our listeners know it's a really great space and it's a beautiful setting. So if for nothing more than getting a great view of the lake, go and visit Rogers Park in the museum.
The park was originally designed by a student in Frederick Law Olmsted's studio, and she was quite well known as one of the first women park designers. Her name was Margaret Sewell Cautley, and she grew up in Bolton Landing Summers. And with the New York State's waterfront revitalization funds, which became available to local governments in the mid-90s, that park has been totally restored. You'll notice the walkways, the new band shell, and the stormwater management controls that make it a truly both a comprehensive environmental park, but one that's incredibly welcoming to visitors. I mean, there's very few spaces on Lake George where the public has an opportunity to be on the lake, and this is certainly one of them.
Yeah, for sure. Let's dive into the exhibit, though. You know, when people hear the title Vacation Paradise of the 50s and 60s, what's the story you're hoping they're going to discover?
With the Depression and World War II, Lake George as a retreat for the wealthy Americans of the Northeast was replaced by an economy and a tourism economy that was meant for the newly mobile middle class Americans, which and an emerging middle class that developed some mobility after World War II. There were the cars and the highways that brought them to places like George, but there was the upward mobility, the rise in income, the rise in the labor unions that made these vacations possible, so that suddenly Americans had both the freedom and the means to take 2-week vacations. And the lodgings that housed them on Lake George were cottage colonies, motels, cabins that were replacing the great mansions that once lined the west shore of Lake George. So you not only had a social revolution, you had an economic revolution. And it's, I think, our case that was essentially a 2 to 3 decade period when Lake George sort of reached its zenith. And there are many aspects of this exhibition, just as there were aspects of the Lake George economy. For instance, once Lake George, 50,000 people a year were coming to Lake George in the summers following World War II. Once they were here, what were they to do? And so we saw the rise of the roadside attractions and the theme parks, and that became a whole other dimension of the Lake George experience for the vacationer.
You sort of touched on this, Toni, but what was Lake George like before World War II? Was it really just mansions along the west coast or the western shore of the lake?
Certainly, there were not simply mansions. This was not the Newport Gold Coast.
Okay.
But they certainly dominated the landscape. And of course, there were smaller houses, and there were houses that were not necessarily on the lake. For instance, most famously, George O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz lived on a farm on the other side of the road from the lake. And much of that architecture, you can see that it's essentially old farmhouses. And those were used as summer houses or even boarding houses. So it was certainly a more modest summer landscape. The great hotels were clustered in either Lake George Village or Bolton Landing or Hewlett's Landing. And but as they deteriorated, as wood structures would tend to do or to become burned down, they were not really replaced. And that's why those properties became available for redevelopment after World War II by entrepreneurs.
When visitors walk into the exhibit, can you tell us what do they encounter first? How is the exhibit actually structured?
It's broken into different segments, actually. And the first thing that you really see is some blown up postcards, very 1950s, that, welcome you to Lake George, or greetings from Lake George, I think they say. And a bunch of promotional material, some booklets, pamphlets that were created by like the Chamber of Commerce. I think that's correct, right? And and a lot of maps. There was a lot of new snazzy promotional material that was suddenly being made to, I think, probably to market this new image of Lake George that was, suddenly very modern. So you see that first. And then the next natural progression is to the great new infrastructure, like starting with the Northway, which was really the focal point of the news at the time. A lot of the stuff in the exhibition comes from our archive of the Lake George Mirror, which was obviously a great document of that whole time period. And Toni has written about all of these topics individually over the years. And a lot of your information and a lot of our images, they were really supported by what was written in the Lake George Mirror at the time. So, and you've also had an incredible archive of other materials that you've been collecting forever. So we basically had an archive in our basement that I got to pick stuff from. And okay, so we go to the Northway, Prospect Mountain, $1 Million Beach, those all suddenly seemed like brand new, really exciting and progressive ideas, I think, to create these things.
The Prospect Mountain development, that was really quite projected to be quite a large endeavor, much more than what we ended up having. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because, as we say in our displays, the age of Aquarius was replacing the age of the automobile. There was a general disenchantment. I mean, realize that the Prospect Mountain Highway was completed in 1969, 1 year before the first Earth Day, and people were making the connection between automobiles, the despoilation of the wilderness, I think the disenchantment with big government projects, the sort of the New Deal consensus was coming apart. And so this is essentially the completion of the Prospect Mountain Highway. It bookends this entire era, and there was not enough enthusiasm or money to create this somewhat grandiose vision of this palace on top of a mountain that was somehow going to be functioning year round. And it's very interesting that Nelson Rockefeller, of course, had his wires into every major architectural firm in the country. And he retained Paul Rudolph, who is probably best known for designing the Yale School of Architecture building. It's somewhat known as Brutalist, to create some designs for this Prospect Mountain summit apex. And of course, it was never built. And that, of course, is the question that we're left with. Why wasn't it? And what changed that made the enthusiasm for these projects diminish? In fact, a former conservation commissioner who was in Rockefeller administration when this project began later said, why did we even build a highway? We should have just used the old incline railroad that torn up during World War I. So that's a picture of, again, how the economy was changing and how the social views were changing. And in a way, why Lake George seemed out of date and no longer popular by the time we reached the mid-70s. And it went into another, I would say, period of decline as people sought out more authentic historical experiences than they'd found in Lake George, because this is what we're talking about. Lake George was what was modern. It was, it was the world of tomorrow. And of course, nothing ages more quickly than futurism, right?
Yes.
So, and so I think it took Lake George for a long time to recover from that what shall we call it, a hangover of modernism. And what retrieved it, I think, was just the beauty of the lake itself and the renewed attention to protecting Lake George. I think as you're well aware, Lake George is probably one of the best protected lakes in New York State. It's the only lake with its own state agency. There are numerous lake protection organizations looking out for it. And of course, there's the Jefferson Project, which was created to make Lake George the smartest lake in the world, which is collecting all kinds of data, which is used for on-the-ground solutions to protect the lake from pollution.
What did a typical family vacation look like in 1960 when families came up here?
I grew up in Warrensburg, so I was aware of that.
Okay.
And whenever we had visitors, my parents would book them in the fanciest hotel in Lake George, which like the Georgian or something like that. And,
Yeah.
So,
well, the overall impression was that Lake George was glamorous and fabulous, for a while there, at least. When you look at the images of the motels and things that were built to replace the corroding old Victorian hotels, they were clean and sleek and modern and, fabulous advertising. And there were so many restaurants and nightclubs and so much cultural entertainment. I just get the vibe that Lake George was, hopping 24 hours a day.
Yeah, but I also think it's true that some of these cabin colonies, and this became, you become more aware of this as you talk to people who were introduced to Lake George through these. So whole families would come up together to one cottage colony for the same 2 weeks. And they were entire worlds unto themselves. Many of them, what is it? Was it the continent, the American plan, where they could also have all of their meals
They're
there?
complete resorts.
Yeah.
Resorts. Yeah.
So and then they would have all the water activities. They would have water ski schools at night. There would be, entertainments. I mean, these, whether it's like teenagers who are working in the kitchens would, put on shows. But I really think it seems as though for a relatively modest amount of money, one could have a really kind of fun, just an experience that was probably unlike anything you would have encountered in New York City or in the outer boroughs. And then, of course, there were other aspects of this entertainment business, the dude ranches, where literally people would, have a Western experience in the middle of the Adirondacks. Why that seemed like a good idea to somebody, I don't know, but it seems to have made sense, and people certainly seem to have prospered as a result.
Yeah, and a Polynesian experience at the Tiki
Right.
too. So it's
A little
fascinating.
bit of everything for everybody.
Yeah.
That's like a whole other strand of this. Why was the tiki stuff popular? Well, everyone coming back from the Pacific. So, we're still dealing with a post-war generation and what they were interested in, what they were seeking.
A lot of those places still exist today. I mean, the Tiki is still operating as a restaurant. I haven't been in years.
We see the signs that say Polynesian show, but we can't attest to that. Actually.
Okay.
I think they only do it one weekend a year now, or something.
Well, they have that
June.
weekend, but no, they do have some kind of Holland or Tiki entertainment like every night.
Wow, that's cool. And a lot of those, one thing that has surprised me is, a lot of those cabin colonies still exist. Maybe not to the scale of the 50s and 60s, but there are a lot of places up here where, it's a property that's a collection of cottages, maybe with a motel too, but they have everything. There could be a restaurant, or you could do your own cooking. But they have all the water sports, basketball courts, things like that. And that hasn't totally gone away.
I think in Lake George, again, Lake George may be different than Loon Lake and some of the other lakes in the Adirondacks, but more and more, I think I can think of maybe one that's still functioning, a cottage colony, quarters, because all the rest, they become, for instance, let's take some of these resorts, like Pioneer Village. Well, those were all turned into essentially individual cottages, and all of these properties were all sold off. And so you could have bought a cottage with lake access. Now I don't think you could buy one. If those cottages come up for sale, they would be close to $1 million. And I think even in the 30 years that we've been running the Mirror, most of those have disappeared and have been replaced. If they have not been demolished, they have been essentially condoized. And you drive out 6-8 on Cape Cod, all those little cabins are now condominiums. So I think it may well be a question of degree, but I think the future's already written that, yes, these will become individual homes. And that's what's said about Lake George, is that it's cyclical. Once there were houses, they were replaced by motels and cottage colonies. The cottage colonies and motels are now being replaced by townhomes, condos, and in some cases, McMansions.
Yeah. You touched on this a few minutes ago. One of the big things that struck me was the nightlife. I almost felt like, wow, was it like the Vegas of the Northeast? I mean,
It seems that way, doesn't
it
it?
really did.
I have a picture I'm looking at, and it's some of those ads you had posted, and it has in kind of a Western themed lettering, the Klondike Room featuring buckskin Bill Selden, the Gold Digger Girls in Linda.
The Klondike Room. I've never figured out where that is, but
It was in Alfonso's, and that was, according to this, across from Storytown.
Yeah.
So across from the Great Strait, probably where the parking lot is.
Yeah.
and showgirls were a big thing in all of those places.
Yes.
Slightly alarming. And the way they're featured in the ads is certainly very interesting.
Yes.
Almost Victorian in a funny way, but yeah, there were tons of restaurants, tons of nightclubs. It was crazy. And really, there were places that were open 24 hours a day.
Wow.
And with amazing, entertainment, seriously famous performers would have several floor shows a night at some of these hotels. And,
Yeah.
dance till 3. You could have dinner at midnight. You could stay at one place all night long and then have breakfast at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning.
Right, I remember, one of the ads, dancing until 3 and then a breakfast buffet that followed. And
Vacation in Lake George sounds exhausting.
yeah.
I was also impressed with sort of the artifacts. There's a display of motorboat motors. There were, the thing that really stood out to me was the plaid cooler from Thermos, because we had one of those.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, there's our cooler. And it's little things that, again, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so I'm a little bit behind, after that heyday. But I remember a lot of those things. It was really neat.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because when we decided we were going to do this exhibition, I was trying to think, well, what do we actually have in our museum collection that I can use for artifacts? Because I knew most of it would be, paper.
Ephemera.
Yeah. But we had that tartan cooler in there. And I remember from my childhood that every single thing we had for vacations and picnic paraphernalia was all tartan. What was that about? I started looking at advertising from that time period. And, it was the mad for plaid time. And so some of the ads that generic ads that I ran from the time do emphasize that. And then I started finding all that other plaid stuff like the thermos set and the bowling bag. And
Right.
So, but definitely some, iconic of that time period.
Before we forget, let's just give some details. The Bolton Museum, listeners, is right almost in the middle of Bolton Landing on Lakeshore Drive. You can't miss it. It's a beautiful structure. You guys are open from Memorial Day to October 31st?
I think it's October 13th this year.
October 13th. Okay. And you're open 7 days.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So people can stop in. It's a great place to visit on a sunny day and a rainy day. So it's a great stop in. And can you just give our listeners the URL for your website?
It's www.theboltonmuseum.org.
Thank you. It used to be the Bolton Historical Museum.com. But
theboltonmuseum.org. Okay.
Now, can I throw in, and you can certainly edit this out, but this is not quite shameless self-promotion.
Oh, we're all for that. So go right ahead.
We're shameless and self-promoters.
Okay.
So
That Lisa used, for instance, when you see the brochures, the signs, and you may have noticed that when you walked in, the so-called Adirondack Guide. This was printed by Adirondack Resorts Press, which we own the rights to because they were the publishers of the Lake George Mirror. So when we purchased the Lake George Mirror, we also purchased the rights of this archive. And what we discovered, and this is relevant because what we discovered as we went through this material is, first of all, we recognized, one, that the Lake George Mirror was a great chronicle of the evolution of Lake George from that resort for the wealthy through the Depression and World War II, and then the revival of Lake George through this new economy. And so we not only understood a narrative from a very close perspective, a lot of the statistics that are found in the articles about the exhibition or in the exhibition themselves come from Lake George Mirror articles who are calculating closely and if you know motel owners, they know precisely how many people attended, visited their motel that year or how many tables they turned over that weekend. So those are great documents, but it also was a great visual source of documentation. Adirondack Resorts Press had their own printing process, which they invented, and that's why some of this material is so distinctive. It was also, by the way, at one point, the largest employer in year-round employer in Lake George Village. So it has some, significance on its own. But I do think that, what Lisa and I purchased the Lake George Mirror in 97, started republishing it in 98. And we essentially educated ourselves about the history of Lake George through publishing the Lake George Mirror and drawing upon these archives and understanding that there was a consistent narrative that was being documented by the Mirror and its various editors.
So have you been thinking about this exhibit for a long time? How long did it take when did it become an idea? I guess is my question.
You want to know the weird origin of this exhibition?
We love weird origins.
Because Toni has been writing about this in different increments over the past, 20 years, right?
At least, yeah.
And we always have published articles based on all of these elements in the mirror using great graphics and imagery. A little over 2 years ago, the museum inherited an amazing collection of clothing from, how would you describe Pat Hoops?
The late Patricia Bixby Hoops, who was from a prominent, wealthy summer family who married into a prominent, wealthy, year-round family. The Hoopses were the owners of Finch Prime. And they were what would you call it, a bright young couple in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah. She was incredibly fashionable. And my background is actually in fashion and fashion history and costuming. So when we got a call from her that she was in her 90s, I think, and decided that she had to start getting rid of stuff. And she asked me if I wanted to come look at this stuff. And if I wasn't interested, it was going in the dumpster. So I thought, I'd better get over there and look at it. And I had no idea, her family, they've been around forever. So I didn't know if it was going to be new stuff, Edwardian, Victorian stuff. I had no idea. So we started going through her closets, and she just started loading my arms up with all of these evening gowns and fancy day dresses and all kinds of stuff. And I could just tell by looking at it quickly that they were amazing garments. So I got them back to the museum and really went through them and saw that they were really this perfect timeline of fashion history from about 1949 to 1969. And I thought, okay, I want to accept this gift. What am I going to do with it? How would I ever have a way of displaying this as doing a fashion exhibition? And then in about 8 seconds, it all downloaded into my head of what we could do, that it would be this exhibition. It came together instantly. So last year, when was the opening year of the exhibition, and that small room that has a painting exhibition in it now was this room full of mannequins that had this beautiful display of garments in it. But so that was where it came from. And then I immediately understood how I could put it together very quickly with all the imagery and from our own archives, and that every article that he'd ever written would become the basis for the whole thing.
But
so it came together.
Lisa
really
says quickly. I don't think Lisa had a spare moment between, let's say, October 2024 and opening day Memorial.
Well, I worked on it 24 hours a day for about a year. So, but there was not a lot of time to think there because we just decided we were going to do it.
I really have to compliment you on that because I visited this past September, and when I walked in, the woman at the desk, I explained what the Lake George exhibit was about, and that's why I was there. And then she said, and in this room we have this display of dresses, and I said, that's going to interest me. I spent a solid 45 minutes just easily going through all the Lake George exhibit, and then I'll take a look at the dress. I feel bad because she pointed it out to me, and if I didn't walk, and it was fascinating. Just the size of the dresses. I'm a fairly big guy, and she must have been a fairly small woman, but just so many dresses. I'm looking at pictures of them now. And then the way you incorporated all the advertising for the dancing and the other thing, on the wall surrounding it, I probably spent a good 15 or 20 minutes in there. I liked it so much I took pictures of it to show my wife.
That makes me so happy. Well, that's why I wanted context for these dresses, because I know a lot of people think, what do I need to see a fashion show for? But they really were like all the silhouettes and all the details. Everything was such a perfect timeline. And they were so glamorous, and Pat was so glamorous, and she was probably, out living a fabulous life in Lake George at that time.
Her best life.
And all of the restaurants and things, they really promoted how glamorous and fabulous they were. I thought that those really created a backdrop for the dresses. So thank you.
Perfect. I enjoyed that.
Was there a particular artifact or photo that was really a challenge to locate?
Not really. A lot of the things, like some of the artifacts, I did part of the time that I spent working on this 24 hours a day was being on eBay looking for souvenirs or like one of my favorite things is the part of an exhibition on the roadside attractions of the placards that used to get attached to everybody's car
Yes.
so that the attraction could get free advertising. You know, I went back and back and back to eBay till I found one from almost every place in Lake George. I don't know. It's like I dreamed it up and somehow there it was
It all
online.
came
The
together.
interesting thing that I think after the first year, a lot of people were introduced to Lake George through camping on the islands, which were once able to like rent an island for like 6 weeks. You know, these people would take you out, set your tent up, and essentially leave you there. And that, of course, is now, I mean, you can rent it for a weekend or something. But so many people came to Lake George by way of these islands that I think they wanted more about that experience. And I think it was I don't even know what, we tried as hard as we could to try and document and illustrate that. But, you know, what kind of artifacts are available that can really document that particular experience?
Really, because the first year there was nothing on camping or camping on the islands because I didn't even think of it as being an entity that would be valuable in this because I didn't see anything. So then when more than, several people commented on it, so I tried to find things. I got some stuff on campgrounds and I think 2 postcards of camping on the islands.
Well, how do visitors react to it? You know, is there anything that really surprises them? Are there lots of people who come in and say, oh, I remember that?
I don't know if people knew what to expect when they were coming in, but I think it has been so much more popular than I was ever imagining because there is so much there. I think there's so much to spark memories and people are just loving it. A lot of people have come in and seen a picture of themselves in the 60s in there, which they love.
Yeah, that's been a lot of fun. So we've been able to take photographs or publish photographs in the newspaper of people whose family took pictures of themselves with their earlier versions of themselves. And that's really fantastic. I wouldn't go so far as to say it validates their experience, but it's at least, there's something of their past that's being documented and that people are taking their lives and stories seriously, whether it's, you ran a water ski school or worked for the Chamber of Commerce and you're there, you were a part of it. And of course, I think we all know that that's something important about living in a community, isn't it? To be a part of it and to have that recognized.
I was going to say, I don't know if all these people who are, people who are like our age and a little older who all grew up here and worked in all of these things. And, they loved it at the time. I don't think they've ever thought of themselves as a facet of history, So to come in and see this whole thing, I think it probably made that whole era gel for them in ways that they might not have when they were just living it,
And I think we all need to feel like we're situated somewhere in history, somewhere in time. I mean, it kind of contextualizes our own lives, I think.
It's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that. Is there an aspect of the Lake George experience that has remained consistent? Or when you were putting the exhibit together, were there things that you were discovering or uncovering or pulling together that felt like, gee, this is still very true today?
I mean, it's the obvious one, but it's the beauty of the lake that has attracted people, not only from the 1890s, through the Depression, World War II, and after World War II and through the 50s. People were coming back for the lake. Whatever the roadside attractions, it's really the lake. And going back to the point about it's the best protected lake in the Northeast, that has made it this consistent experience. People, of course, will always complain, the lake is not as clear as it was when I was a kid, but it's still remarkably clear, remarkably clean, and a wonderful experience.
Depending on which source, many say it's the cleanest lake in the U.S. And we've had the Lake George Land Conservancy on, and we've had other folks on who, people still drink the water from the lake. So it's really, that's always so interesting to me.
If this exhibition were to have a sequel, it really would be the birth of the environmental movement within the Adirondack Park, in part as a reaction to all of the development of Lake George and the creation of Lake George as a vacation paradise. Not only did the rest of the Adirondack Park recoil in horror to what was happening in Lake George Village, but everyone from Nelson Rockefeller through, environmental thinkers, I think were encouraged to strengthen the Adirondack Park in order to prevent the overdevelopment, which Lake George Village almost, what shall we say, either embodied or threatened to overwhelm the rest of the park. And we might also say, why was the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake created? Why was the Adirondack History Center in Etown created? As a reaction to the roadside attractions. People like Harold Hochschild worried that people were not going to understand the authentic Adirondacks because all they were seeing was Frontier Town and Serpentarium. That to me is a unique story. That it's no accident that Governor Rockefeller created the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of Adirondacks as the Northway was being completed, because everyone knew that the tourism pressures were going to build as a result of the Northway. So the APA was created in many ways to forestall the overdevelopment of the park and respond to all of these pressures that were coming to the Adirondacks and to Lake George. That could be a cool exhibition, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I would add, though, that, let's say the Northway, which, for instance, the conservation groups like the Adirondack Mountain Club opposed building the Adirondack Northway through the Forest Preserve. But in the process, of course, it passed. And in the process, Adirondack Mountain Club developed a whole new constituency for wilderness protection, because people were able to see and experience the wilderness for the first time, sometimes only from their car windows, but nevertheless, there was a greater appreciation of wilderness. And so I don't think it's accidental, is it, that the environmental movement became a popular movement at the end of the great tourism era, not only in Lake George, but elsewhere.
That's interesting. And for our listeners who may not realize this, that the highway that you take, if you're coming up I-87 from New York City, I-87 continues. That is the Adirondack Northway. And I think you said earlier, it was completed in 69, 67?
No, I think its actual completion was celebrated in 1967.
Okay.
Prospect Mountain was 69, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't until before that time, the only way to get up in the Adirondacks was to go up what's Route 9 today. Which is
Route 9 then too.
Route 9 then too, but is also, if you're from New York City, it's the West Side Highway. It is it's the same Route 9 that goes through Westchester. So it's really, when you think about that, it's fascinating, that if you were a family of 4 coming up in your car, you came up here pretty much on a 2-lane highway.
63, because as you know, the Northway was built in sections. So by 1963, the route between Albany and Lake George was completed. So that kind of, induced a spurt of activity.
Yeah.
That's when it became really busy. So you're right. But and of course, everyone still remembers those day-long trips. And of course, there's a famous overlook. It's no longer there because it's been overgrown, but that's where the trains used to pass into Lake George Village. That, of course, was all open in order to protect the woods from forest fires. But as you came down Route 9 from, let's say, from Glens Falls to Lake George, the whole vista opened up. And as the artist Rockwell Kent said, the promised land.
That's amazing. And people often deride Lake George Village for its commercialism. I love it. I think it's like its own little time capsule. There's no Gap there. There's no McDonald's. It's kind of like preserved. But I love that, families can still go there and walk, in the middle of the village and have an ice cream cone, or go to Shepherd's Park and hear a concert. And it's all right there. I think it's a fun little spot to sort of reminisce about the heyday of Lake George.
Nice place to visit.
A nice place to visit.
The only thing I would add is it may not be appreciated that this museum is funded in part by the town of Bolton. So I think the museum board, I'm no longer a member of the board, Lisa's vice president, feels an obligation or responsibility to utilize that space in ways that will not only benefit the town economically by attracting tourists, but also, again, to reflect the community back to itself. It is truly a community institution, and I'm sure the board is grateful for the town's support.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and for some listeners, we should really emphasize it when we're talking about the attractions of Lake George being the Lake George Village, which is completely separate from Bolton Landing.
You're right, Stephen. It is a distinctly different community.
Yes.
And, both communities would agree.
Yes.
And Lake George Village sometimes says we don't want to be Bolton Landing, and Bolton Landing says more than once we do not want to become George Village. And Hague says we don't want to be either of those.
Right. Well, we always say this, with 6 million acres, there's room for everybody up here. So that's great. Speaking of next year, are you contemplating what next year's exhibit will be?
A committee was formed recently to explore ideas for next year. And we're thinking that since this was so popular, we want to do something that really focuses on Bolton through the years, like Bolton in the probably businesses from anywhere, like from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and what's there now. We have a nice archive of a lot of photographs. And so I think it's going to be, a comparison,
but more Bolton Landing centric.
It will be Bolton centric.
How much time does the typical visitor spend when they visit the exhibit?
Well, for Welcome to Lake George, the people who work at the desk have told me that people have come in and spent like an hour or 2 hours. In the past, things that have been simple, even when we did a painting exhibition, people would breeze in. Some people would spend, 10 minutes looking and breeze out. I haven't really tracked that yet, but this year I've really remarked on the comments that people come in and spend an hour or two.
Yeah.
So
professional curators tell us, you have far too much stuff. You need just a few items that people can focus on. No, people want to see stuff.
Yeah.
Especially with something like this. Yeah.
The new wing was designed by a Bolton Central High School graduate and Columbia Architecture School graduate named Rupert Caldwell. And he based that on the vernacular architecture of the barns and the boathouses of Bolton. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. He has not been given sufficient credit for what I think is a building that's truly enhanced the community itself.
Yeah. And I said at the top, it's a beautiful, beautiful space. I was really struck by that. You have some construction going on. Are there other renovations happening in the building?
Yes, where the original building was the old Catholic church. It had no insulation, no heat, no nothing. It was no, climate control, which is kind of essential for a museum. And when we added on the wing, we had there was sort of a disaster with some sanding of sheetrock, and that front part, the church, had been sealed off, but somehow somebody cut a slit in the plastic sheeting, and sheetrock dust got in there and all over every single thing in our collection. So over the years, it's taken 10 years to get to the point where we've been cleaning it all, rehousing everything appropriately, and figuring out what we really want to do with that church, because it used to be kind of a mishmash of everything, and sometimes just old stuff that didn't relate to Bolton at all. People would give us stuff just because it was old. So we're reevaluating our archives, and because we realize now that the importance of a history museum is to tell stories, to tell local stories. So we're renovating the church. We've had a new roof put on. Some of the interior, like insulation, I think, has been done. And in, I guess, the next couple of years, we're going to have the interior finished.
So again, it's the town. The town owns the building, and the town has been very successful and very assiduous in getting grants to complete this work.
That's great. That's great.
Hopefully in a couple of years, we'll open with what we'd call our permanent exhibits.
And that's very important to the local residents, because I think they feel that that's their museum, and that's what houses their archives and their donations, and they really want to see it.
Well, that's great. It's great that you have such an engaged community too. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. We could probably go on for another hour. But before we let you loose into the wild, as we like to say, we always ask our guests to share their favorite place in the Adirondacks, or a favorite place, because nobody has just one. But it can be anything. It can be a hike or a paddle, a overlook, a favorite restaurant or store, or another museum. Whatever you really treasure, or places where you like to take people who've never been here before. We'll ask each of you to name one or two that you'd urge our listeners to check out for themselves.
But it can't be the Bolton Museum.
It can't be, thank you, can't be the Bolton Museum.
This may be self-serving, but I'm also the chair of the board of the Sembrick Museum, which is just an exquisite little jewel of a museum. And it's so well, a lot of people still don't even know it exists.
Right.
And as much as we've been working on it for the past 20 years, I think a lot of people have a fear of opera and classical music, but you don't need to fear those things to come and see the Sembrick. It's just a beautiful, beautiful little place. So.
Don't be afraid to look at the dresses. You might learn something. Don't be afraid of opera.
And this year we do have a great costume exhibit.
Oh, cool.
And for those who might not be familiar, the Sembrick Opera Museum is the former home of Marcella Sembrick, who was considered one of the greatest divas, I think, in opera history. She was world renowned, and she bought property up here and had her studio up here, and it's now a museum and also a very active performing arts space, and it's right on the shores of Lake George, and it's a beautiful, beautiful property. And again, another pocket museum that's worth seeking out. Okay, Toni, what spot are you willing to share?
Well, Lisa's comment made me realize that the Sembrick, for instance, is one of the few spaces where the public can get access to the lake simply by walking across that point and experiencing its beautiful views. And as you know, most of Lake George, the best parts of Lake George, are either inaccessible to the public or are privately owned. So in recent years, I've become fascinated with what I call the democratic spaces of Lake George, which include the Sembrick, but also Shepherd Park, Hearthstone Park, Prospect Mountain. These were deliberately and intentionally created to be public spaces where the public could enjoy the lake. And it's true that philanthropists endowed them, George Foster Peabody, Edward Moore Shepard, the Trasks. But I think we owe them a debt of gratitude for permitting access to the lake and allowing everyone to enjoy Lake George, that it would not be restricted to a few wealthy property owners. And I think that's, that's one of the things that makes Lake George special. Everyone is welcome.
Well, thank you again for sharing all of your great knowledge with us. And listener, if you are interested in visiting and learning more, we urge you to visit the website. Steve, what's the URL again?
TheBoltonMuseum.org.
And the website's got a ton of information about the history of the museum, too. I really commend you on doing a fine job on that as well. Thank you again. And we'll look forward to seeing you around Bolton Landing.
You bet. And it was nice meeting you both.
It was really great to meet you. Thank you, Jane and Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was another terrific conversation.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. They're a neat couple.
They are. And it really reminds us that history isn't just about dates and artifacts. It's really, really from that exhibit, you get a really great sense of how people lived and traveled and celebrated and created memories.
Yeah. Maybe we can share some of my photographs on the website.
Oh, yeah.
So you can get an idea of what was there. There's a YouTube video I had sent you probably last October, and you probably don't have it any longer. Or I sent you a link to, and maybe I'll try to dig that up as well. It's like an 8mm movie that somebody filmed driving through Lake George in 1967.
Oh, wow.
It's only like 8 or 9 minutes, but I don't even think it's that long, but it's just kind of neat to see.
All right, listener, if you're planning to visit Bolton Landing, be sure to add the Bolton Museum to your itinerary.
Definitely.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get our podcasts, leave us a rating and review, and, share this episode with a friend.
Definitely. And if you have a comment, a concern, a thought, you may email us at info@adktaste.com.
And while you're online, why don't you go visit adktaste.com, where we have more stories about events, travel ideas, and hidden gems in the Adirondacks. And while you're there, sign up for our newsletter. Comes just once a week, but you get all these great insights delivered right to your inbox. Thanks for listening to ADK Talks, and we'll see you out there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.